Okay, so I'm going to be talking about my family history of bipolar disorder. We're going to talk about my dad's story with bipolar disorder and how that affected him. Oh, too far, sorry. So, with my dad, he has always struggled with bipolar disorder. He was diagnosed pretty early on compared to most. He was about 17, 16 when he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Back then it was called manic depressive disorder until they changed it. And my grandparents, which are his parents, had decided to place him on medication. And back then, because my dad would have been 52 this year. So, and he was born in, I think, in the 1970s. And back then, they were still trying to figure out medication. And from what we've learned in class, a lot of the medication, they were just slapping labels on there. It didn't matter if it actually helped those with mental illness. It was like, this magic drug is going to fix all of your problems, from anxiety all the way to mommy's little helper, and with my dad, they just placed him on medication in like the late 80s, and for him, he struggled because he could never find the right medication to help with his symptoms. He had very severe manic depressive disorder. When he would be in his downslopes, he couldn't get out of bed. He would be glued to his bed. He couldn't function. He couldn't do anything. He was very depressed. He wasn't able to eat or sleep or anything because he didn't want to function. He didn't want to deal with the world. It was overwhelming for him. And then when he was manic, he was fixing cars, fixing computers, doing things a mile a minute, very erratic. And he would get frustrated because the medication wouldn't help balance him. And so it led him to searching for drugs. And I know this because my dad has told me this. I used to write letters with him when he was in and out of prison. But when the medication wasn't working for him, he fell victim to addiction to narcotics. And he would seek his own medication through marijuana, through methamphetamines. And as we know today, that only magnifies the symptoms of manic depressive disorder, bipolar disorder. And so when he was manic, he would be doing robberies, or he would be committing felonies, or like one time he rewired an entire complex to one internet box. And he would start projects and not finish them. Like, he would take multiple computer towers and try to put them together, but never finish them. Or he would start working on someone's car, tell you what's wrong with it, and then be stuck working on the same problem for a week straight. Even though he knew how to fix it, he could never finish a project. And so it was debilitating for him. And his illness was already a struggle within itself, and then on top of the addiction, it only made things more difficult for him in his life. When I was born, as much as he loved me, he had already had a severe addiction. And so he spent the majority of my life in and out of prison, struggling with his mental illness, struggling with his addiction. because every time he came out of doing a prison sentence, he would find himself going right back to the marijuana, going right back to the methamphetamines, because he didn't know how else to stabilize. And that was his way of trying to balance his manic episodes and his depressive episodes to the best of his ability. But in reality, it wasn't helping stabilize him. If anything, it was making the depression worse. It was making the manic stages worse and just debilitating him to the point where he couldn't do anything without the drugs. And that took a toll on my own life, which I will get to later. And so he ended up trying to stop methamphetamines the last time he got out of prison in 2011 in August, and he tried to just medicate with marijuana, because ever since he was originally diagnosed and prescribed medication, he never took over-the-counter medication after that, and it was just self-medicating through marijuana and methamphetamines, and he ended up passing away 2 weeks before I turned 16, and the doctors just think that it's from years of abuse. And so we lost my dad on March 10th of 2012. And so this is my dad. And this is one of the few photos of my dad and myself. We were at Goofy's Kitchen, and that's one thing about my dad that I do appreciate through his illness and through his addiction, is that he always tried to do as much as he could for me to the best of his ability. And he never really liked to take photos. Sorry. So now I'll go into my story with having bipolar disorder. So this is me when I was 3. So I was misdiagnosed for many years. When I was 5 years old, I was diagnosed clinically depressed. And even though I showed manic and depressive symptoms, it wasn't until I was 18 that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But in my teen years, I would show symptoms of being severely depressed. I didn't have it as bad as my dad. I like to call it functioning depressed, because as much as I would want to curl into a ball and not deal with anything, turn the lights off, and just shut down, I still would force myself to get up and function to the best of my ability. But just like my dad, it was still a heavy burden for me. And I would show signs of manic episodes by becoming really erratic for a week to 2 weeks. And I would want, like, it almost felt like I was on top of the world and that I could do anything and everything. And I could actually finish projects. Like, if I wanted to rearrange my entire room, I would do that. If I wanted to, start a puzzle and get stuck on it, I would do that. But something that will always stick with me is because my grandparents raised me, because my dad was in and out of the prison system, and they would have to get consent from my dad to place me on medication. And at the time, I was still diagnosed with depressive disorder, so it was around the time I was about 12. And for years, my dad kept saying, no, don't put her on medication, because that's what started my addiction to narcotics. And then by the time I was around 12, he finally caved in and told him, go ahead and put her on medication. And unfortunately, the medication didn't work for me either. And I think a big part of that is, even though we had been farther along with the advancement within the medical model of trying to help those with mental illness, if the diagnosis isn't correct, how can you help the person? And I think that's a big struggle that we still go through today. Because I was being prescribed just for my depression, but not the full scope of my mental health illness. And about a year later, I was drinking, smoking cigarettes, smoking marijuana, abusing pills. So I would run away from my illness in a sense, because I couldn't deal with the depressive state anymore. I couldn't deal with running 100 miles per hour every single day for a week or two on end, because I couldn't sleep. I struggled to eat. The insomnia grew unbearable. I would be up 20 hours a day because I was manic and I didn't know what to do. And so I couldn't function, and I couldn't deal with my feelings, and so I went self-medicating myself to try and cope and to try and deal with the illness. And again, by the time I was 17, 18, it was around the time I graduated high school, the psychiatrist finally started to notice a pattern of bipolar disorder, with my ups and my downs, with, a week or two just constantly like an Energizer bunny, constantly doing something, constantly moving, can't sit still, very irritated, very erratic. And then I would have extreme downs, and I would be very depressed, and my downslopes have always lasted longer than my manic stages. And so I fell into a very deep addiction for a long time. I fell into methamphetamines, I fell into heroin, I fell into cocaine, like any drug that you can think of, I fell victim to, because I was trying anything and everything to not feel what I was feeling. I didn't want to feel like I was out of control in my own body. I didn't want to feel like I couldn't function. I needed something to help stabilize me, and even though I sought it out in the wrong ways, it still somehow made me function, if that makes sense. But at the same time, I was killing myself slowly because I was seeking help in the wrong areas. I eventually sought help for my addiction, and I haven't used drugs in over 4 years. And this is why I've learned that drugs only make the illness worse, because it magnifies the symptoms. If anything, I was more manic, I was more irritable, I was more erratic, I was more depressed when I would come down. I was so angry all of the time. And I recently made the decision to go back on medication, and for some reason this time it's working. I feel more stable. I feel like I'm in more control than I've ever been. And I think that has to do with the progression of not only creating medications that can help those with mental health, but also realizing that mental health is a severe problem. It is a disability, and people do need help with living and coping with life. And it's possible if we seek out services. Because, at least in my opinion, because I tried to live with it for so many years, thinking I could handle it on my own, and I did need help through therapy and through psychiatry, and that helps to stabilize more than I could ever stabilize myself. Do I still have manic moments, and do I still get depressive states? I do, but they're not as magnified as they were when I was using drugs